everyone. My name is Alexi and I'm the managing editor of PA. As you already know, today's live interview host is James von Klemperer. He's the president and design principal at Kohn Pedersen Architects. KPF is an award-winning practice. Their works ranges from house to transportation and cities at a global setting. Can you all hear me? If yes, type yes, please, so that I know you can all hear me. Yes, hi James.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Doing well.
Yeah, you seem great. So I've done an brief introduction about yourself. So I was wondering, could you talk to us about yourself? And also, I know that you've done your first studies at Harvard in history and literature. What led you to study architecture?
Yeah, well, probably that I love to draw from childhood on, not buildings, insects, fictional characters. I just love to draw. And so I took some art history courses at Harvard in architectural history. In particular, a great man, James Ackerman, sort of the dean of the history of Renaissance architecture, a wonderfully magnanimous and deep-thinking fellow. And but I got to the end of my undergraduate studies, and as you mentioned, it was in another field. It was history and literature, and literature is an area of thinking which is about, in many cases, beauty, the aesthetics of language, of storytelling, of structures, of poetry, etc. History, on the other hand, is focused on society, and we read about the French Revolution and about 1848 conflicts in London and Paris. And so bring two things together, the sort of aesthetic side of thinking and the social purpose of history, was something I was curious about. So I was fortunate. I got a great scholarship to go to Cambridge University at the end of my Harvard years to study whatever I wanted. It was a free year. Whatever you want. I could have studied medicine or philosophy or law. And I thought, because of this exposure I had to the history of architecture and a love of travel and buildings and cultures as they're displayed in cities, they're embedded in cities, let me give it a try. And it was a wonderful, wonderful year, and that set me on my course.
Okay, and I forgot to mention one thing actually to our audiences. I think you've realized there's a question box down below. If you could all write your questions there, after a few minutes, I'll be answering the questions with James. And moving on to the next question, what makes KPF special and what is your design philosophy?
Yeah. Well, I think what makes the place special, and I had to discover this because I came as a young architect after trying to do some freelance work and traveling around getting jobs in different parts of the world. But it was early on my start at KPF. And it appealed to me because at that point, it was a place where young people could come to practice and bring to bear the ideas that they had studied in school, often ideas having to do with the theory and history of architecture, or kind of speculative ideas about where cities should go in their future growth. But you could apply these in real projects at significant scale. And that's sort of what the place is today. It's a kind of an engine of realization of bold ideas. So to say that there's a philosophy for a firm such as this, which is a collaborative firm of many minds and many hands, isn't quite right. And it brings the question, does architecture really have philosophy or not? Strictly speaking, it doesn't. I remember a lecture I attended of a very well-known Austrian-Swiss architect, where he was asked about the meaning in his buildings. And some graduate student in literature asked him, what is the meaning of this firehouse? And he said, I don't think it has much meaning, actually. To be honest, it has no meaning at all. It's a building. And so, you know, buildings do have meaning, but not heavy-handed meanings. And I think if there is an area of meaning and philosophy that really appeals to myself and my colleagues, my partners and collaborators at KPF, it's a kind of embedded meaning where buildings say something about the city, the society, and the culture in which they inhabit. So we can read the culture of earlier ages in the handwork of the craftsmen who made the brick or the stone. We can see also some flights of fancy, of imagination, that those with pencils in the Renaissance could make drawings of ideas of buildings. But I think for a building to have meaning, despite what the quote or the story I just told is very important. I mean, buildings are not senseless objects. They're not simply utilitarian vessels. They tell us about our aspirations of society, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit later in this discussion.
Okay. And I'd like to know, how will KPF adapt to changing user demands with a particular focus on the current crisis and the potential changes in the expectations and requirements as a result of the COVID-19 crisis? What is your thought of the new role of architects and designers will be, and the impact to the industry, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's a serious and kind of a monumental series of questions for us all in every walk of life today, in many parts of the world. As you know, and architecture sits squarely in the middle of this, because for us, urbanism, city culture, city mechanics, and density create the platform in which our work thrives. Our buildings generally are these kind of mixing chambers of multi-use in the middle of the most highly traveled parts of New York, Hong Kong, London, Paris, Shanghai, LA, wherever.
Yes.
So this, and I was in a conversation yesterday on kind of such a webinar with the Deputy Mayor of Paris, Jean-Louis Misica, and his formulation, which is one that we share. This challenge is, how do we actually reconcile distance with density? And it's a near impossible task, but we must try to tackle it, even if it's for the next year or two. I think it only makes sense that in the fullness of time, and we hope it's shorter rather than longer, but it might be 18 months until there is some medical help of vaccine, that we will need to find ways to re-inhabit cities, to calm traffic on streets, remove traffic from streets, replace in a way the car with the individual or with groups of people, to make walking lanes, to have, as they have done in Paris and I believe Milan, to allow cafes to spill out into space that was not theirs before, so we can expand our space. There obviously will be issues having to do with public transport, with lifts, with many ways in which we use space that is necessarily confined, that we don't have answers at this point. But I think that the bigger issue is the long term. We have to get through the short term to get to the long term, but
yes, hopefully
the world after 2 years from now. And I think at that point, many of the things that are particularly difficult for us today, that here we are sitting in front of a screen in a kind of a suffocating separation from our friends and colleagues and others. But what do we miss? We miss the places where in a city, not just the commodity areas of the places where you sleep or where you work at a desk, but the parts of a city that have to do with the qualities of life that come as an adjunct to those core functions of living and working. And I mean restaurants, libraries, jazz clubs, parks to walk, play, sports. All of these kind of enriching aspects of city life will only become more important to us in our designs after this period, because we realize that living without them does not allow us to do many things that are fundamental to our purposes. Of course, we can survive, we hope, at this point, and it's tougher for some groups of people than others, for people in some of the service callings that make them help us allow them to help us to have food, to have medical service, et cetera, right now. But for many of us in the professions, we can continue our work. But it's in a way because we're drafting off of the relationships, the personal relationships we've made for the last 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. So can we as a firm of 700 people function to make 50 projects at a time right now happen around the world? Yes, but only because we've known each other so well and the relationships that we've invested in, and I mean in a money sense, but a personal way, to build the kind of communication in teams that allows architecture to be created between us and our clients. These relationships cannot be so easily generated now in this state of life. So as we look to the future, I believe the kinds of designs of urban projects that connect, that bring mixed uses together. After all, there will be a time when this threat of the terrible COVID virus is gone. And then we'll understand and remember even more so, kind of like somebody after Prohibition who then turns to have a drink. You sort of thirst for the thing that you couldn't have. And it in a way, it perhaps is instructive. It tells us at this point how to think about those future conditions. And for the clients with whom we're now working, and this goes for clients around the world, whether London, Shanghai, New York, wherever, they are actually thinking well beyond the restrictions that we are feeling now. And they're putting into their programs the very project types that are now completely abandoned, like hotels or retail. So it's a time also that I think, and last note here, it somehow can bring us together. There is an interesting way in which when you pass somebody, I bicycle every day for half an hour to stay sane outdoors here in the suburbs of New York. And when I come across people, they wave to me. Nobody waved to me in the New York suburbs before. If I have to go pick up food in a car and I stop to let somebody come across the walkway, the person nods and smiles. So, we can't speak to each other in the closest of ways, but there is a time now where we are perhaps being brought together as, one human race, one group of people in a town or whatever.
Yes, I think so as well.
And architecture is a social art. So I think, maybe we can harness some of these exchanges of good feeling.
Yes, I do strongly believe that. I think in the past couple of years, we've been quite lucky as humankind, really, with being free about designs and designing however we wanted. But I'm hoping that this crisis will end soon because, as you mentioned before, retail and many other industries are affected, and including us as well here. We are in the lockdown, and during weekends, we're not allowed to step out at all. I know that some countries like US and UK do allow you to have your daily exercises, but we're not even allowed for that at all.
Amazing.
But I also want to ask, as an architect and the design principle of a global practice, you're trying to embody the goals you need to achieve as a society for a sustainable future of our cities. How do you advocate imperative resilient architecture to your designs?
Yeah, well, these are before our current COVID period, which has been so kind of all involving and distracting in a way, necessarily. The discussions about resiliency, about climate change, about carbon footprint, about water levels, about renewable energy, et cetera. These were the topics that when we woke up every morning or when we went to bed at night, we thought about. We try to direct our practice and redirect our practice because these were not such overriding issues 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. But we really need to return to those topics. I was listening to a fellow who is a leading environmental scientist here in the United States recently, talking about the potential of harnessing the period we're in now when actually skies are clear in Shanghai, when you can see, through the haze that isn't there in New Delhi, we might be able to take some steps forward to de-automobilize our cities, to reduce some of the influence of cars on carbon footprint. But I think we're going to have to get back to that. And the big challenge right now is going to be that the coffers will be empty of the federal governments in our various countries, of the private developers. Financing is going to be very tough. And we all know that the cost pressures on buildings, large buildings of the sort that we're involved with, often will squeeze some of the more advanced environmental engineering out of a building before it squeezes out the columns or the curtain wall or the elevators and some other aspects that are deemed more essential to actually putting up the building. So there needs to be a new way of consciousness and concern about, in particular, the carbon issues, because that is as existential a set of issues, maybe not as immediate as in what happens to me today or tomorrow or next month, but what happens in the next decade and beyond. But it's as existential an issue as the issue of public health and infection that we're facing now. So we in our practice are committed to this. We have made for our internal operation a carbon neutral proposition of donating to funds that are building growing forests in Brazil and parts of Africa, et cetera. That's a kind of makes us feel good about our work, but what really matters is performance of our buildings. And so the various codes and goals of the American Institute of Architects 2030 Challenge, or New York's Law 97, which requires some diminishing of the carbon footprint. This forms the agenda for our work even today.
Okay. And also touching again to the topic of sustainable architecture, KPF is generally known for building mixed-use schemes and tall buildings. How convenient it is building new structures, do you think, especially after this time, after the crisis as well? You have designed the redevelopment of a public housing complex in Brooklyn that was devastated during the Hurricane Sandy, which was a need right now to do the redevelopment. Do you think architects should concentrate more on renovating or redeveloping buildings?
Yeah, it's become not only one of the better sources of work, and we all need to feed ourselves to practice, but it's become some of the most interesting work in our practice, and the kind of the coolest work. If you say, come into a room of young architects in our studio and say, who wants to work on this or that? It's often now the renovation, the restructuring, the repurposing of buildings that is, those are the projects that everybody is keen on. So that manifests itself in many ways. These are in some cases today, we're working on a series of industrial buildings in Hangzhou, buildings that made spools of wire and now will be re-inhabited as places to shop and live and so on. Well, that's not outlandishly unusual, but it's something new for that particular culture. I don't think that such concrete buildings, barrel vaulted old spool factories, were valued in the same way 10 years ago in Hangzhou. And I think clearly, in terms of the carbon footprint that we were talking about, the best solution is not simply to make a well-engineered building. It's not to have to build an entirely new building at all and to reuse structures. So this means not only rebuilding parts of buildings, it means changing functions often, which is sometimes marvelous because in some strange way, we often enjoy living in a place that was not meant for living because we feel kind of inspired because it's a different kind of environment. So we like living in a loft space, or we like working in spaces that were not meant in a conventional way to distribute air and light and circulate with elevators in the same way that we used to. So yes, the renovation of projects is very important. One last thing on that note is I think in the design of today's new buildings, thinking about how they will be transformable in the future is important. That means logical column bay systems, good ceiling heights, natural light that can penetrate. I mean, obvious things, but that are often, again, designed out of buildings when it comes to the pressures of economic concerns in architecture. So we're aiming very much in that direction to look for the kind of flexibility. And today's COVID period only proves to us we need to be responsive to things we cannot predict, very serious things in the future.
I do agree really with all of the things you said as well. And also when I read about your projects, I can see design culture or city-oriented designs. How do you manage successfully to balance the form and function? Which principles do you follow when creating skyscrapers?
Yeah, well, it's the dialogue between form and function. You could say the dialectic is a constant sort of wrestling match or a dance, you could say. And these buildings, since you mentioned tall buildings, are buildings that are governed by some very demanding strictures of forces that are applied by wind normally, sometimes earthquake at heights of up to 500 meters or more. The vertical transportation systems are essential. How else could you make such a building useful? And those are very demanding of space, and on and on and on. So those kinds of projects, they may make interesting processes of design, and there's a kind of a going back and forth, as architecture often asks us to do, but not to conceive of a formal idea too early on before you've had a chance to kind of ingest and make intuitive your understanding of some of the technical physical forces, as I mentioned, of structure or internal space planning, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So I think in that light, one of the ways in which we like to work is not to be too precious about our design. And that means to make some ideas, some sketches, or have a team to come up with some ideas that we're happy to throw away. Because only if you're free to reject a bad idea are you able to find the good idea. So it was one, again, an Austrian, I happen to be an Austrian citizen, by the way, an Austrian philosopher, Ludwig von Wittgenstein, once said, you have to be able to climb up the ladder, but then to be free to throw the ladder away, because that allows us to reach a higher level of understanding. But so with this struggle between the idea and the practicality of the building, we have to be very free in offering many options. So our process at KPF is very much of an iterative process. It's about making many ideas, many schemes. Not that we're practicing by trial and error, but every scheme that doesn't work is more than a lesson. It's an inspiration to the next one that will. And I think that's the fun for all of us of architecture, not regardless of scale, is that it is a non-linear thinking process. And it demands a kind of a versatility of the brain, which we all tend to be pretty interested in.
Also, what came to my mind is sometimes, most of the time, designs change quite often. When you try to apply certain principles. And I was just wondering, do you mainly think that the first design is always, if you were thinking of it built, do you think that it was the best option to build, or are you satisfied usually with the end version mainly?
Well, I think you try to fall in love with the end version, because that's your child anyway, in a way, and we all love our children, so that's a rule. But sometimes the first idea is not the best idea, and I think some of the best examples of architecture that can help to lead the way, in the work of our profession, is architecture that turns the assumption on its head, that changes the paradigm, and that's not always the first thing that comes, to mind or to the mind's eye. So we look at the architects whose work we respect greatly, and let's say Le Corbusier, the hero of early modern architecture, and the way he thought about the paradigm of living in a large apartment building in the Marseille block was sort of the opposite of where one might have started in a more conventional practice of the time. And consistently, he was reinventing the typology of architectural order. So I think often rejecting the first idea is a good thing. Now, there may be a first idea that happens to be the best one, And then it takes a certain wisdom and maturity, which I see in some of my partners, to be able to recognize that and say, now, just because it's the first thing, let's not throw it away. And that takes discipline, because often in your work with clients, the client thinks that just because you moved ahead means it's better. And sometimes the very best buildings are the first idea.
And also, there's one question I'd like to ask. How do you make a glass skyscraper meaningful? Can you give some specific examples?
Yeah, I think the debate and the discussion about glass in large buildings, and usually that means in urban settings, is critical for our work today. And it has been a discussion going on vigorously for the past 10 years and maybe longer. These are issues very much that have to do with context of climate, the physical context of light and energy and performance, with the function of the building, of course. Some building, residential building doesn't really want to live in a glass enclosure because of issues of privacy, or you enjoy art and want to put something on a wall. But also in terms of the urban fabric, the way an exterior of a building adds to its ensemble of a street or a neighborhood. And glass architecture has become, it was a dream of early part of the 20th century. Mises' drawings, Bruno Taut's ideas of the glass city were just enthralling. But we came to the point where glass became a default material. Ended up being, in many settings, the cheapest and easiest way to throw up a building. And then we began to understand that there are deficits. That just what I was talking about earlier, that one can understand and read meaning in a piece of architecture through the craft of the way workmen, engineers, thinkers about how things can be put together emerge in the buildings of the neighborhoods of cities we love are not always achievable in buildings which have very little physical feature, if you will, detail. So I think there's a return today to a love and exploration of texture, which has yielded some beautiful work around the world by some of the architects we respect most. And I think some of our work really achieves that beautifully, and especially some smaller scale residential projects that we've done in Covent Garden in London, or downtown here in New York, in Soho and on the West Side. But then there are places where glass architecture comes into its own again. And one of my partners, Bill Pedersen, designed a beautiful building in London, just finished, known as the Scalpel. Well, it's one of the sleekest, cleanest pieces of glass form at a larger scale to be found. What's wonderful about it is that it serves, and the reason for it, this form, is it operates in dialogue with buildings around it that have a tremendous amount of texture and surface articulation. Notably, Rogers, the insurance building, the major insurance exchange, Lloyd's of London, or even the cheese grater next door of Rogers Stork Harbor. So that building, by contrast, as a glass sculpture, contextually provides a beautiful kind of complement to all of the detail next door. Doesn't mean it would be the right building for 6th Avenue in New York, or the Ginza in Tokyo, or whatever. So these are issues of response and relationship between the parts of the city that I think inform some of these questions of glass architecture or not.
And I think one of our audiences, Hani Kaveh, I hope I pronounced it right. How can we prevent technology and consumerism dictate on how we design? I think she wants to ask.
Yeah, very good question. I think we feel and live that question every day in our work. But I think, as we answer the question, we think about how technology and consumerism are actually at the root of many driving forces in our work. After all, for urban architecture, which I think is what we're talking about, at least in most of our work at KPI, their commerce forms the foundation of the cities. Cities are engines of commerce. So how did the first village or town come to be in the first metropolis? Because they were trading posts. Look at Xi'an, the Tang Dynasty in the year 800 or so. These were trade routes that brought people together. So yes, architecture is a kind of expression of commerce. Now technology, architecture, I believe, comes from the combination of the words ars and techne, the Greek words for art and technique or technology in today's speak. So, but how not to be enslaved or limited by these tremendously powerful forces, but to harness them to make better buildings, more beautiful buildings. Often, I think, it's a matter of understanding commerce and understanding technology, embracing and using these as ways of being inspired or doing something intelligent and useful. So, this means sort of not trying to swim against the river of those forces of money and of science. But I think at the same time, it's important for all architects as we work in these contexts to assert a little bit of the primacy of architectural design making and values, and simply to go with the flow, to get back to the river analogy, and say, okay, if it's cheaper, it makes more money, fine. Or no, we have to remind our clients, and this is part of why architecture requires a huge amount of communication, skills in communication, and skills in education. We are educating our clients all the time, even as we educate ourselves. Explain to them why saving the last 1 or 2 or 3 or even 10% of a building budget might actually obliterate 50% of the value of the design. That is a kind of message we need to be able to explain and articulate. But you don't win by just punching back always, because as an architect, you don't hold the power. You are not holding the millions or billions of dollars of investment money. You are not changing the march of technology. So ideally, in the practice of as we see it, these factors are our allies. And if we're intelligent about understanding what are the economics of urban real estate, it helps us. Mm-hmm. And certainly what are the kind of techniques of water management or of structural support or of photovoltaics on the roof, any of that, we must be more than proficient in those areas.
Okay, thank you very much for answering that question from our audience. And also, you've recently completed the newest skyscraper to the city of London cluster this year, the Scalpel skyscraper. But also, you've completed in New York, as far as I remember. I think, was it 52 Lime Street? If I'm wrong?
It may have been one Vanderbilt tower.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes, that question, yes.
Yeah.
That project.
Yeah, and I'd be happy.
Would you be able to talk to us about the design as well? It's quite a unique building to its setting as well. What makes it so special to its context?
Well, it's a special building because it's going to be one of the children of the COVID period. It was supposed to open up in August. So, after 10 years of making, it will be postponed by a month, but it's still happening. So it's a testament to the kind of the courage of the New York workforce and particularly this developer to go ahead and
Sorry, James, I'm just interrupting. I think there's a technical problem with the call. I think the question isn't disappearing from the screen.
Oh, that's right. How do I do that? How do I make that happen?
Oh, it's okay. I think we'll have to, I'll need to end this interview.
Okay.
Or, oh no, apparently I can just continue. It's fine. Okay. It's fine, they're saying.
I can rise above the question. How's that?
No, it's fine. Yeah, it seems good. Okay, yeah, it seems good now. Yes. Okay,
great.
Thank you. I'm just, sometimes there's this problem. We are not sure why it's happening as well.
If it's still underway, I can actually look in the screen like this better.
Yes, anyway. Okay, if you don't mind, really.
No, that's fine. I'll just back it up and you'll see the question
Thank
eternally. All right, so back to One Vanderbilt. That's an important project for us. And I think for New York, it will be the tallest office building in Midtown. Vanderbilt is a project which, although it's the densest kind of building that we know in the city, it's 30 times the area of its site, and on a tight urban site, that's almost unheard of. But the reason for this density is that it connects directly to public transit. It connects to Grand Central Station.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to make the building happen and come to be in terms of the equation of urban economics, the city gave this developer a substantial amount of area extra in the building in return for a direct connection to public transit and the coming into a private building of public functions of train halls. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a kind of an amazing hybrid of a public and a private building at those lower levels. And that ultimately the kind of urban means the urban mission of the building is to connect, to allow for one of the two major transit hubs of New York to thrive. Grand Central Station would not have been able to work. There's a new program of doubling the ridership in Grand Central, which is one of our great hubs, because of something called East Side Access, which is bringing new traffic from Long Island into the station. Huge change. The old building of 1913 would have failed in terms of its circulation. If you made a medical analogy, it would have had a heart attack. And so instead, we sort of performed this bypass operation of allowing circulation to come through our building. So in that fact alone, forgetting the physical design, the shape, the form of the building, is an amazing thing for a high-rise building to be able to do, to be in effect the most generous sort of throughput engine for pedestrian and transit circulation at its base.
Mm-hmm.
The building itself is very much a New York building. New York is a grid, so everything in the building comes from the plan of right angles, and yet the building tapers towards the top. And as it does so, it becomes almost a point. And given the fact that it will be one of the already now it's up in structure, the most visible building on the New York skyline. The skyline is also in a way public property. You know, we view the city with its signature skyline. So the building comes to the point where it makes a very delicate sort of impression against the sky. And at the very top is a public space for those who want to go up and look around the city and experience an observation deck. That's also wonderful, that the public is at the top and the bottom of this tall structure.
Mm-hmm.
And in between are the floors of, law firms and banks and so on.
Yeah, sorry, it's just I'm trying to test something as well. And also, I think you were saying about this project that the construction is still ongoing. Am I right?
Yeah, it is.
Even at this time, still you're allowed to go on with the construction process as well. Right.
Well, New York were forced or required most construction sites to shut down for clear reasons because we want to keep the workers safe. A few projects, though, were given a kind of exception. They had to do with essential needs of the city. And because this project connects to the below grade and to the trains and to what will become the public transit throughput that we all need in our lives. The city doesn't want to stop that from advancing. So that's the bottom of the building. The top of the building was not quite complete in a physical sense. There were wall panels that could have flapped around. There were pieces of construction that could have been dangerous at a high wind at 1,400 feet or 430 meters in the air. So that part of the building was given the kind of dispensation to continue work. Now, in between, I believe, is going on as well, because the mayor of New York and the city council decided that some aspects of commerce, of the banking center functions of New York, would need to be supported through this period. If you shut down the economy because you shut down the exchange or the banking industry, a lot of people suffer.
Yes, exactly.
Anybody with a pension fund or anybody trying to borrow money to start a small business. So that project continues. So in a way, it's a bit of hope for us to see something that continues on, even though many sites have stopped.
Is this the only project that's been ongoing then? Or is there a couple more that?
No, there are others. Is that there are a handful of projects in the city. I can't honestly don't know how many exactly, but it's
Okay.
you know, severely restricted right now.
Okay, and also I'm wondering, have you been receiving a lot of projects as well recently after this COVID-19 crisis, from especially international projects or competition projects mainly?
Yeah, well, yes, actually. I mean, we're very fortunate as a firm that our work continues at a pretty robust pace right now. And that's not, we wouldn't have expected this at all, given the severity of the situation.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of that work is right now coming from China. It's coming from the large technology-based and oriented cities, Hangzhou and Shenzhen, but also from Shanghai. And you know, I think it's in part because the Chinese government, and some of these are government projects, but many of them are private enterprise, has made a concerted effort policy to either directly stimulate the economy or through large companies that have a relationship with the central state to say we need shovel-ready projects, because so much of the Chinese economy has been based on construction, and so much of the growth of commerce has been spurred on by making of new parts of cities. So these are what we call shovel-ready projects that will be ready for work in the ground very soon, and they're really exciting projects of multi-building clusters of mixed use in these cities. So, you know, China, in some ways, has been the first country out of the medical and public health kind of emergency situation. They seem to have gotten back to work okay. Also leading the way, I think, in terms of our profession of architecture and those who we work for, developers, to say we can continue. So, so yes, there are also, believe it or not, some new commissions in New York, and they have to do, again, with developers who see where they will be in 3, 4, 5 years. And for those who have the cash, the money, or the backing of a large pension fund, let's say, it makes sense to continue on, because some of those construction prices, if they go to market to buy their structure or curtain wall in 6 months to a year, those prices may be well lower. And the product will come to market in 4 or 5 years when they can estimate that the return of investment on rental and sales of apartments or office space or whatever else is coming back. So I won't say it's a rosy picture. It's going to be a slog. I mean, it's hard work, but I think so far so good in our firm.
Yeah, I think it kind of sounds that there are some disadvantages and advantages as well from this crisis for certain practices like KPF, I think, because it's good that during this time your projects are still ongoing. And I think it's a great motivation as well for everyone who can see your projects as well during this time. And I know that you're doing the traveling fellowships as well. So you offer Kohn Pedersen Fox traveling fellowships. Are you involved in the decision making? And how do you select the recipients as well? Do you look at their work or more their program knowledge?
It's really, well, we look at a portfolio of work of about 40 different entries. Now there are hundreds entering it in a way, but these are offered to the students in schools where principals in our firm have graduated. So that's you know, 40 principals. So there are many schools thrown into this batch. That includes the local schools here in New York, or the East Coast of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia. But it's not just those, you know, Ivy League schools. It's Tongji University, it's University of Oklahoma, it's Delft University in London. And so what happens is that the deans of those schools select the 2 best student portfolios to be advanced. So we have the pleasure of looking at them. So it's a fascinating process, and we're very gratified to be able to continue doing this even through an economic downturn, because again, it gives some hope and inspiration to young architects. The way I do participate in the jury, and we take it seriously every year. So we ask an architect, an educator, it's usually the dean of the school, who has served on our jury in past years. So whether that was Deborah Burke at Yale or Mohsen Mustafadi at Harvard or Monica Ponce de Leon at Penn. This year's jury was chaired by Stephen Hull, who has been teaching at Columbia for 40 years or so, but has a wonderful, great body of work as an architect. But also Ken Frampton, who is one of the leading architectural historians of our age, and Eva Frank, who is the head of the Architectural Association in London, and another architect who used to work with us in New York, Eric Haller. So it's a wonderful chance to talk about what's important in today's educational system in architecture. What is valued? Is it expressions of technology? Is it forms of this sort or another? Is it research into social programs in the student projects? So we look at them all for an afternoon and intensely, and then we have a debate about what matters, and then we choose three, and we usually can't help ourselves because we give three other honorable mentions away because there are so many worthy portfolios.
Wow, that sounds really great, actually. And also, what are the visions for KPF's future, do you think?
Yeah, well, gee, that's always an interesting question because the future is unbounded.
Yes.
And a good part of it now is how do we get to the other side of this gulf of this time of a restriction of movement and of normal behavior. So, but I think in the broader view of how practice could evolve and what we care about, it's usually to try to tackle the most urgent issues of our time that go beyond sometimes the use within the building. I would say the externalities of building design that do have to do with the environment, have to do with sustainable factors, have to do with carbon footprint, but also with urban dynamics of how people get along. I think the kind of the inequality of life in cities is something that's been a lot of concern about that across the ages, in particular now. At the end of the last boom of great wealth, there was concern about excess and those who weren't well provided for. And now during this period, there's a special concern about those who are more needy. Architecture is not the agent of total social correction. We can do what others in other disciplines can, but it plays a large role. And so the public realm and how people interact in public and the spaces that are made where everybody can enjoy life, that is a big part of the kind of large projects that we undertake. So for the future of our firm, to focus on those issues in ways that are evolving because of the conditions of our work changes is really important. And also within the firm, what's important is to give the opportunity for the exploration and expression of more than 100 minds of designers who are thinking together and allow for the collaborative spirit of an office to thrive. That's something that's not easy to do. And the founders of the firm, Bill Pedersen, Gene Kohn, who now coming towards the end of their careers, did a marvelous job of setting up a culture where there was a kind of a give and take between the sort of the wiser, more senior architects, the junior architect. Everybody was free to come in and debate and offer their ideas to maintain that control or to grow it into something, a new version thereof. That's really an important mission for us because some architecture firms get kind of stale after a while, and you have to keep changing what you do in order to allow for that kind of fluidity of practice that really brings out the best in the group of people with whom you're working.
How do you think today's technologies will affect architecture's future? Like 3D printing as well, material innovation is quite trending right now. And how do you think this will affect us, especially the use of parametric tools as well?
It's been really the one of the great stories of architectural history in the past 20 years or so. The coming of of IT into drawing, but also thinking, and as you're implying, the making of buildings too. So I think the use of script to actually manufacture parts of buildings is something that we're seeing a little bit of, not maybe not as much as we had imagined, but I think it's coming. It has to, because the efficiencies will be there, and hopefully it means that there's a kind of a craft. We think of making beautiful things with our hands or other people's hands, but there's a way in which the use of technology to make pieces of buildings, to let's say water jet cut stone, or to photo etch panels, or to assemble things even, can unleash some really creative powers of design. That there, I think, will be a kind of arrival or a growth of something that you might call a kind of cybercraft in architecture. And I think, for the betterment of the beauty and performance of buildings. So that's something we want to get more and more involved with. I think one of the most exciting aspects of parametric thinking, or of sort of machine learning thinking in our firm, comes from a group which we incubated and now is a very important part of our firm, which we call KPF Urban Interface, KPF UI. And these are architects who are working with data to try to understand how urban dynamics, how the flow of people through in a pedestrian setting should be understood in order to change the shape of space. They're looking at the analysis of energy, and of course we have energy models for everything, but they're taking a step beyond to understand how all of the factors of design, space design, energy performance, even the emotional response, they're trying to understand through measurement or charting of people's pathway through a city, how what you see when you walk down the street makes you act differently. If that can be recorded, then maybe we know better how to design the next building. So we bring that to every project that we work on.
I realize we have, I think, roughly 8 minutes left, and I just want to ask, what do you think about our platform, Parametric Architecture?
Yeah, well, I think it's great that you make this your mission to serve as a kind of exchange for ideas about the ways in which drawing, technology, building come together. And I particularly like the fact that with your platform, it comes a completely ubiquitous set of opportunities. In other words, it's totally international, and it's very accessible to being able to feed in and feed out and learn from each other in the kind of marketplace of ideas about parametric architecture and practice is great. So I plan to make better use of it myself. I'll be a regular
visitor. Yes, please.
And I think it's a really nice idea. I like the fact that it's so accessible to architects of all descriptions, of all ages, to students, and that accelerates this exchange of knowledge, accelerates what we can do for sure.
Thank you very much. And also, as a closure, with all the experiences you have had, I'd like to ask you about what kind of advice you'd like to give to young architects and students as well.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy profession. We know that, but I think for those who love what they do, it's one of the most rewarding ways to spend your life. And I haven't spent a whole lifetime in architecture. I've maybe spent half a lifetime or 2/3, but I can see from what some of my senior colleagues have lived through, and what young architects are experiencing too, that the sort of tangible result of what we do as architects, to make things that we can experience and love to experience and give to our communities, towns, etc. These are things that are not going away. Some friends of mine who are, let's say, newspaper journalists or media gurus, wonderful things that they make, but they're fleeting. They're here and they're gone. Or people I take the train every now and then to come into the city with, who are bankers, and they make fantastic fortunes with lots of zeros after the bonuses. But I'm not sure that they get the same satisfaction that the average, even the average architect in our office does, of creating something of lasting value. And I think to keep your mind on, keep your eye on that ball of the importance of what you're doing, because it is not to be taken lightly. And the last thing I would say is back to the root of the word architecture, that I mentioned earlier, the R's and the technique, the art and the technique. That kind of equal valuing of the imagination and the broadly free idea of design, which is what we embrace in schools often. And on the other end, the very hard-nosed, real tough and gritty realities of the construction of buildings, to be able to bring those together in your practice makes you strong as an architect, makes you realize how much sort of import your work has. And that's not always easy to keep straight when you're in school. When I was in school at Princeton before practicing after Cambridge, it was a highly theoretical program, and the student projects resembled more films or novels or sculptures, which is okay. I benefited a huge amount from that, but I missed tying that to the kind of practical realities of the construction site, or of the intrigue of thinking about how materials influence building. And I think to the young architect, I would say keep your eye on those two areas, and don't ever lose the excitement of either one, even as they might and should still exist, uncompromised in your mind. So keep the imagination going, as you probably were asked to do in school. Imagine things that are a little bit crazy. Take chances, because you will realize them in some form, in some scale in your work.
Okay. Well, I'm sad that we have to come to an end now with the live discussion. Thank you very much, James, for your contribution to our live series. It's much appreciated, and it was great to talk with you, to get to know your project, your office, and yourself as well. And I hope you take care of yourself.
Yeah, I'm fine, and thanks for the opportunity. It was a really nice break in the day, and I look forward to seeing some of your broadcasts from fellow architects in the future. And all the best to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, we've come to an end again. Thank you all for listening and watching, and we shall be uploading this soon on our channel on YouTube, and you can see it on our account as well later on as an IGTV. Thank you all. Bye.